Oh Maidens in Your Savage Season is a story rarely told in this amount of detail in an anime. It is a story about teenage sexuality and also their emotions and their changes to their body which are overwhelming them with confusion. The opening scene of the show introduces us to the literature club, which we will be following for the entirety of the show. They are reading aloud a very explicit part of a book which describes in lush detail the act of cunnilingus. Reactions are mixed between embarrassment, shock, and a sort of childish distance to it. Each of these girls has their own hang-ups about sex as much as they are interested in it. Some choose to avoid thinking about it entirely, frowning upon their sexually active peers, insisting that they avoid using the word sex and instead replace it with a different word. And some actively seek it, trying to inch closer towards the experiences described in that literature. All of them are changing. Encountering sex in literature now leads them to see it absolutely everywhere, and they are confused and overwhelmed by the experience. In them, feelings are welling up that they cannot name. The entire show is about this struggle to find and name and really allocate these feelings that are arising inside of yourself around that time. It's about the process of sexual maturing. This is explored through a lot of romantic hijinks, which will really hit close to home for anyone who's been in that phase of their lives themselves, because in all their awkwardness and stumbling, it is really authentic. What surprised me was how a show so focused on the internal development of teenagers would in the final act suddenly shift to introduce a serious threat from the outside. The principal and the vice principal trying to ban non-platonic relationships at the school and closing the literature club. At first I was completely lost by this. Why in a show that was so far only tangentially about society are we focusing on this now? Why is this the dramatic finale? Well, it isn't. Episode 11 ends on a cliffhanger, but in episode 12 the entire situation just deflates. Instead of the important discussion with the principal, we kind of get a funny theme of the principal and vice principal not really caring about the situation and instead just disappearing for the night, leaving our protagonists to figure things out for themselves during the night. They congregate at school and play a very odd game. Color tag. The game is played by one person shouting out loud a vague color, something intangible and subjective, and the others all need to run and find this color, try to think through the other's perspective and feelings and understand what they could mean, or else they'll just be tagged. What an odd way to resolve conflicts like this. But colors are highly subjective and dependent on perception. Research shows that cultures that have more nuanced words for colors can actually differentiate between more different shades of that color. So vague differences between shades of colors are harder to find and really hold on to if we don't have a word to assign to them. Heck, some cultures even weren't able to properly tell the difference between green and blue for a while. Take Japanese for instance, where oftentimes stuff that is supposed to be green is called blue. Their word for green is the same word as for blue. The actual word for green was only introduced later. Oh Maidens likens this to teenage emotions. There's a vast complex set of emotions between sexual desire, friendship, love, and the anxiety that comes with all that. And it's hard to separate. Hard to know exactly where the lines are. This is a theme explored through all the development of the characters during the course of the show. And they solve their conflicts by trying to see the other's perspective, by understanding what names they give to these weird, amorphous and intangible things called feelings. And it really works. Whenever they are they run after the one person and the one person only, the one that they are trying most desperately to understand. And by mutually trying to understand each other's feelings, they can solve their issues. They all come to some conclusion here. They all realize something about love and sexuality that they thought to be true by what they had observed or been told or imagined, but found out to not be true at all. This is a wonderful scene in itself, but it's only topped by what happens after. When the threat of the principal reappears, we find that our girls have collectively used all the colors they found in themselves to express their freedom, their love, their desire to love, and their protest against these regulations. In order to be seen, in order to get their right to live a fulfilling teenage life, they've
drawn all these colored protest banners expressing all these feelings that now have names and weight, and they now understand them. Understanding feelings is something that language helped us do. We write about experiences and we give things names. We carve it out of meaninglessness by assigning a meaning and a name.
I think Maidens tells us not only that we need more genuine stories about sex, about all this confusion without romanticization or idealization, stories that really highlight the teenage confusion that goes hand in hand with this difficult phase of their lives, but also that we need to embrace the sexual growth and freedom of teenagers, to give them room to explore themselves and fully understand themselves, and ultimately to liberate their sexuality from the standards that are put upon them. And all this experimenting can really only go right if they have the knowledge, the relatable experiences, the social backdrop, the friends and family, and the literature also, and the art that helps them make sense of these feelings and to work through these difficult parts of their life. Anime shuns depictions of sexuality to this extent. There's a rare anime when sex is even part of the relationship, or at least the consideration of sex. Even adult-oriented anime about adult relationships often avoids this topic. But Maidens makes a strong case that this shouldn't be the case. What this all speaks to is the importance of stories and storytelling for our lives. And this is a theme that Mari Okada, the writer of this show, has explored on multiple different occasions, most notably in The Woman Called Fujiko and in Maquia, When Promised Flowers Bloom.
The Woman Called Fujiko is a very odd show. As part of the Lupin III franchise, it draws on a long franchise history and plenty of well-known characters. But something is off about everything. Everything is a bit darker and more cruel and certainly a lot more sexual. The entire show is radiant with a psychosexual energy that drenches every scene into weird, surreal noir tones. It really is a sight to behold. And similar to Maidens, we have here another example of an oddly explicitly sexual anime.
I'm what you could call a fan of the Lupin III franchise.
But one thing I've always said is that you can measure the quality of a Lupin thing by its treatment of the character Fujiko. She's the femme fatale master thief that operates alongside Lupin, Goemon and Jigen, most often in a very ambiguous relationship where it's never entirely clear if she and Lupin love each other or Fujiko's just in it for the profit. That game consists of a continuing cycle of trust and betrayal when Fujiko manages to seduce Lupin and runs away with money, or when Lupin can outsmart her, and sometimes they even show genuine feelings towards each other. Since many different writers and directors have mingled with the Lupin franchise, we have a broad palette of different incarnations of Fujiko. One of the more striking examples was the transformation of Fujiko within one series, from a borderline evil seductress and occasional damsel in distress to a short-haired, tamely clothed companion of Lupin. This change happened because in the middle of the first series, Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata took over. Seemingly in an attempt to make the series more lighthearted and child-friendly, they made all these changes to Fujiko.
Fujiko as a character probably underwent most of the changes during the entire franchise. Different writers always wrote her in their own way. You could say she's a character that is always written to the needs and desires and ideas of the particular writers in question, who have all been, up to a certain point, been male. Well, that changed with The Woman Called Fujiko.
The Woman Called Fujiko was the first installment of the franchise which was written and directed by women, and were not Lupin, but instead Fujiko was the protagonist. And I'm not just bringing this up for the social justice points, but in fact writer Mari Okada and director Sayo Yamamoto used this opportunity to talk about how women are written in stories. The villains of the show are these weird, surreal, shadowy people dressed like owls with masculine voices. During the course of the show, we are exploring all sorts of little episodic stories of Fujiko and her crimes, or Fujiko in relation to men, or Fujiko in different social positions, and so on, reflecting the meta-commentary on the differences of her appearance in the grand scheme of the franchise. And all this while we continually get snippets and flashbacks to the owls. Flashbacks to some trauma or exploitation in the past. But as it turns out, this is a sham. We were led to believe in Fujiko's past trauma, of it explaining to us her impurity and her fall from grace. But this isn't the case. The flashbacks she was seeing are not her own, but memories pushed onto her. and also by that way onto us. The show's making an interesting point here. We don't question why Lupin steals. He is the glorious master thief, the suave heir to the legacy of Arsène Lupin the Phantom Thief after all. But when it comes to Fujiko, we were immediately so desperately trying to grasp at the sense of what made her so. We wanted to find out what destroyed the purity we intuitively assumed to be present in her past. The show juxtaposes the image of Fujiko going her own way with controlled puppets. People whose stories are being controlled, or even further, people whose stories control them. By making them our puppets, by believing them to be controlled by some story or history that is larger than them, we absolve them of their agency. Their victimhood legitimizes their transgressiveness. But despite all attempts to push such a narrative on Fujiko, which we expect and anticipate by its clever framing, the show doesn't give us this satisfaction. Fujiko isn't whitewashed or absolved. She just is who she is, unapologetically.
The Woman Called Fujiko Mina is a story about stories, and about the importance of having control of your own story, and to not let the entirety of a woman's story be written from a perspective which is just projecting its own desires onto it. Fujiko is unabashedly sexual. She's deviant, she's mean, she's transgressive, she's lying, and she's traitorous, but she's owning every bit of it. And by being this way, by being unabashedly just herself, she is taking control of her own story. She doesn't need to justify it to anyone, or to us for that matter. Another work written by Mari Okada is the movie Maquia, When the Promised Flower Blooms. And because I'm by no means an expert on this movie, I brought along my friend Roggol and asked him if he could help me out.
Both life and death confront people with their legacy, and how much things have changed. Being reminded of their own mortality, many people seek to preserve and halt change. They seek to create an immortality project, as coined by psychologist Ernest Becker. Human beings are made of the physical, but also seek a spiritual transcendence beyond mortal form, in the form of a legacy. People seek to become heroic and immortalize themselves, or to create things that will survive past their death. Stories are a part of this. This immortality project that Okada herself is participating in, as she comments on this denial and acknowledges her own fears and seeks to reconcile these things. While these things may seem arbitrary, they are a powerful motive, good or bad, as those who cannot fulfill their own immortality project often fall into despair. Okada becoming a mother likely caused her to contemplate her own mortality, and caused her to consider what parts of her would be left behind when she is gone. The Eof as people represent those who have no need for this immortality project. They have no need to change or grow. They take as much time as they need and do not upset the balance. They deny attachment to mortal beings so that there can be no suffering or sadness. Instead, they craft hibiol. These hibiol are pieces of cloth and are stories in the most literal sense of the word. The Eof are the only people who can read these hibiol, but as the Eof have eternal youth, they will be around forever, as long as they are not killed. In this way, the Eof are like living books. They are ones who can tell stories long after everyone that story was about is dead. Naturally, as legendary and fantastical creatures that the Eof are, they are prized by many and seen as objects of great beauty, objects that can be captured, controlled, and manipulated. Their immortality is incredibly desirable for humans seeking their own immortality project. The king sends his men to capture as many Eof as he can. He wants to use them as a status symbol. When he has them in his clutches, he fixates on a particular Eof called Lelia, and forces her to have a child with him. He uses the power of a storyteller to create a legacy for himself, to corrupt and twist these legends to legitimize himself and his rule. This is his immortality project. History is written by the winners, and as Maquia shows, there is no winning against overwhelming force. This colonization of stories has gone on for millennia, and we still feel the repercussions today as we unravel the myths about historical figures whose crimes were buried by history. Many natives throughout history have been trampled by colonial powers, and many are still being trampled today by the global superpowers. Maquia herself is indirectly colonized. She changes her hair color in order to not reveal her heritage. She has to disguise her ethnicity in order to fit in. Hair has always been quite political. For example, the afro, which became a symbol of black emancipation in the 1960s and 70s. Maquia must disguise her natural hair colour or she'll be persecuted by those under the king's thumb. The half-elf tells her as much and warns her not to stick out or else she will be discarded. Despite her witnessing the horror and bloodshed from her kin, she escapes and finds a boy, Ariel, who represents a new hope for her to regain some of what she's lost. She meets a family that takes her in and they care for her and Ariel. They have a dog that they play with and Maquia is happy there. But a key moment marks the turning point for Maquia. When the family dog dies and they bury him, Maquia cries as she realizes that one day she will have to bury Ariel. This thought eats up at her, but after some words from Lang, she becomes resolute and promises that she will not cry for Ariel. She can't. She must be strong for him, because he is her legacy. Even though she is immortal, she chooses that Ariel will be her immortality project, despite knowing that he will die. After the eel fails to rescue Lelia, Maquia quickly adapts to a new life as a bar waitress, but Ariel is growing up. The unchanging Maquia is blind to how much things have changed for Ariel, who feels the need to change and is uncomfortable that his mother looks the same age as him. He tries his best to reciprocate his love for his mother, but eventually he resolves to forge his own path, the path of a soldier and a weapon of the king. But to Ariel, this isn't about loyalty, nor is it about escaping Maquia's shadow. No, instead this is about a new story. When Maquia found Ariel, he was in a den of death, surrounded by corpses. The other Eilf with her sees Ariel as a plaything, a tiny mortal soul, insignificant to the immortals. But Maquia denies this. She calls him her Hibiyo, her story. During the war, started as a rebellion by Lelia's Eilf lover, in order to get her back, a new life is born. Ariel's child. This is the first time that Maquia has seen someone being born, a new story being brought into existence. Hope in the form of new life. This is Ariel's immortality project. Maquia is happy. She knows her legacy is safe. Ariel may not be related to her by blood, but she cares for him incredibly deeply. His legacy is her immortality project. Krim, Lelia's lover, comes to take back Lelia from the king's grasp, but she is no longer concerned with herself. Lelia, who believed that everything from her old life was gone, came to believe that her daughter, that she could never see, would be her only legacy. She wants to see her, more than anything. Upon hearing this, Krim is unable to reconcile this. He sees the child and Lelia's legacy as a result of cruel torture and nothing else. He could not ever love this child. His hatred for the king overrides any love he might feel towards Lelia's daughter. So he decides that the Eilf legacy must end here. Their stories are too far gone, too corrupted from what they once were. Krim himself was once peaceful and now resorts to violence in retaliation against this corruption. This drives him to complete despair. He dies in the courtyard where the Renato rest, his legend dying with them. When Ariel awakes from fighting, he finds Maquia standing over him. At first he assumes it to be a dream, but it isn't. The ash marks the terrible destruction that has been brought as the castle burns. Ariel tries to tell Maquia that he's sorry and that he wasn't there for her. But Maquia shakes her head and looks at him with a kind smile. She tells him that his story was always with her. It kept her company even when he was not around. She knew that one day he would no longer be here, so she was able to think of him, and it helped her remind her of her purpose and who she is. The hibiyo that the Eilf craft are not a single thread. They are made of many threads, crossing and overlapping. They represent the many stories that make up a person. Maquia now understands this. She weaved his story into her own, and it is now a part of her forever. But Ariel's story is not hers to control. She sees that Ariel has found a new story to be a part of, and it is her time to leave. Like Krim and the Renato, her legend is fading. She plans to go into hiding. Lelia is finally able to see her daughter. She smiles. Her daughter is everything she ever wanted her to be, without a hint of the king's cruelty. She loves her, but she has to go. So when Maquia tells her to fly, she jumps and lands on the last Renato that Maquia has rescued. Lelia calls back to her daughter and tells her to forget her and that she will too. She wants to escape the pain, to go back to living in denial, to hardly living at all. But as Maquia tells her, she will not forget her child, as much as she may want to. They have said goodbye for the last time, but her story is forever weaved into her heart. Then, these living legends fly off into the sunset. Their time is ending. And what would stories be without an end? Once a story is over, many will beg for more, an extension, more time. But they won't get it. When people die, their story may end, but it will live on in the hearts of all those who know that story. Maquia can tell the story of Ariel for the rest of her life. It is a part of her, weaved into her very soul. The stories in our lives push us forward. They force us to grow, learn and change, to understand others and ourselves. In Maquia, death is not the end. It's a symbolic closing of a book and an opening of a new one.
We now have 3 views of storytelling in 3 different Mari Okada works. Stories that help us understand ourselves and our emotional complexity in all Maidens. Stories to express ourselves with and to assert our individuality and selfhood in the woman called Fujiko. And stories to create yourself with, to relate your history, your heritage, and the future in Maquia. And in all 3 instances, we are also shown how powerful forces or institutions can endanger and exploit these stories. The ban of the literature club and non-platonic relationships by the principal in All Maidens, the owls trying to impose a fabricated story to fit their own desire, causing Fujiko to almost go schizophrenic, and the king colonizing and stealing a people's story to uproot them and control them for his own gains. It is clear that Mari Okada embraces storytelling in all its facets and what it can do for us, and also that she is writing these stories to defend them and to speak of their strengths. But she is urging us to think carefully about who is writing and controlling these stories, lest they be taken away or instrumentalized. Storytelling is what makes up the social fabric, but also our selfhood. We think of ourselves as characters in stories, and stories help us understand our emotions and place in the world better. Stories can be the embodiment of freedom as much as they can be a tool to take away that freedom. Let's make sure we don't let that happen and enjoy learning more about ourselves and the world through stories. Well folks, that was the video.
I'd like to thank Nyard for the opportunity to be on his channel. If you like what I had to say, I plan to expand on Maquia in a future video. I plan to talk about it in relation to Tolkien and fantasy as a genre. My channel link is in the description.
And I thank you, Roggol, for coming on and delivering such a great take on Maquia. And to everyone out in the audience, see you next time.